in 1898, in a temple dedicated to a falcon god in the ancient city of Neckan. Two British archaeologists named James Quibble and Frederick Green pulled from the earth a slab of dark grey-green siltstone, 63 centimetres tall, carved on both sides with figures that had not been seen by human eyes in over 5,000 years. On one face, a king wearing a tall bulbed white crown raises a mace above a kneeling prisoner. On the other, the same king wears a flat red crown and processes past rows of decapitated enemies. Above both scenes, between the sculpted heads of a cow goddess, a name is written in two of the oldest hieroglyphs ever found, a catfish and a chisel. Together they spell a word, Narmer. That slab of siltstone, now known as the Narmer Palette, is kept in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It has never once been permitted to leave the country. It is considered so valuable, so irreplaceable, that no insurance policy in the world could cover its loss. And the reason is this: it may be the single oldest record of a single man unifying an entire civilization. The birth certificate, if you like, of ancient Egypt itself. But here is the thing that stays with you long after the museum closes and the lights go down. They found the man's name carved in stone. They found his image on ceremonial objects across 2 countries. They found seal impressions bearing his mark from the Nile Delta to the hills of southern Canaan. And eventually, after more than a century of searching, through scandal, through rivalry, through the slow, patient sifting of sand, they found his tomb. It was empty, no body, no golden mask, no treasures laid out for eternity. Just a pair of mud brick chambers in the deep desert, open to the sky, holding nothing but silence. Let that settle for a moment. If you are listening to this in the dark, perhaps in bed, perhaps with your eyes already half closed, good. This is a story that does not need the light. It needs only your imagination and the willingness to drift. Let the names and the dates wash over you like water. Let the desert come to you. You do not need to remember everything. You only need to follow the thread, and if sleep finds you somewhere along the way, that is exactly as it should be. We're going to walk together through 5,000 years. We're going to stand in the place where Egypt began. And we're going to ask a question that no one has been able to fully answer. What happened to the first pharaoh? To understand why an empty tomb could matter so much, you first have to understand what Egypt was before it became Egypt. Imagine the Nile. Not the Nile of postcards and cruise ships, but the ancient river. Wider in places, wilder, edged with papyrus marshes thick enough to hide crocodiles and hippopotami. The water is brown with silt carried from the highlands of Ethiopia. Each year, without warning and without fail, the river swells and breaks its banks and floods the land on either side, depositing a layer of rich, dark earth that turns the desert green. The Egyptians called this fertile land Kemet, the Black Land, and they called the desert beyond it Deshret, the Red Land. Their entire world was defined by this boundary. Green and red. Life and death. The river and the sand. Now picture the land on either side of that river. To the west, an ocean of sand stretching toward Libya, broken only by occasional oases, Siwa, Baharia, Farafra, each one a small pocket of green in a sea of nothing. To the east, another desert, rising toward the Red Sea hills, where veins of gold and copper run through the rock, and running between these two expanses of emptiness, a thin green ribbon of life. That is all Egypt ever was. A garden in the middle of nothingness, a corridor of abundance, 800 miles long, and in some places no more than a few miles wide. For thousands of years before anyone called it a kingdom, this ribbon of green was home to scattered communities of farmers, fishermen and herders. They grew emmer wheat and barley in the flood-enriched soil. They kept cattle, sheep and goats. They fished the Nile with nets woven from flax. They buried their dead in shallow oval pits in the sand. The body curled on its side in a fetal position, with a few pots of food and perhaps a flint knife for the journey ahead. The dry sand preserved these bodies naturally, without any need for the elaborate mummification that would come later. A farmer buried in the desert 4,000 years before the pyramids might be better preserved than a pharaoh embalmed with every art the kingdom could muster. These early communities traded with one another. Obsidian from Ethiopia, shells from the Red Sea coast, turquoise from Sinai, cedar from the mountains of Lebanon, floated down the coast and up the Nile in wooden boats. They painted images of boats and animals on the walls of desert wadis, long-horned cattle, ostriches, hunters with bows, and slowly over generations they began to organise. By around 3500 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the first pyramid, something extraordinary was happening along the upper reaches of the Nile. Towns were growing, walls were going up around settlements, suggesting a need for defence. Certain families were accumulating power, and their tombs were growing larger and more elaborate, filled with goods that could only have been obtained through long-distance trade or tribute. At Hierakonpolis, a city the Egyptians called Nekhen, a ruling class had emerged that decorated their tombs with scenes of warfare, hunting, and ritual procession. One tomb, known to archaeologists as Tomb 100, was painted with images of boats, of men fighting, of a figure in white smiting prisoners, scenes that would become the standard visual vocabulary of pharaonic power. At Nakada, another centre of power about 100 miles north of Hierakonpolis, similar patterns appeared. Graves were growing richer, pottery was becoming more standardised. The differences between the graves of the wealthy and the poor were widening into a chasm that spoke of a society already divided into rulers and ruled. At Abydos, a sacred site near the western cliffs, the dead were being buried with goods imported from as far away as Palestine and Mesopotamia. Something was coalescing. Not yet a nation, but the raw material of one, a shared visual language, a growing network of trade, an emerging class of rulers who claimed authority not just over a village or a town, but over a region. These were not yet pharaohs, they did not yet wear the double crown, but they were kings of a sort, rulers of territories that were slowly, sometimes violently, merging. The archaeological record from this period, known as the pre-dynastic, is full of evidence of conflict. Mace heads carved with scenes of battle, fortified settlements, mass graves. The unification of Egypt was not a single glorious event. It was a process, decades, perhaps centuries of alliance and conquest, diplomacy and war, marriage and murder. And then, around the turn of the 31st century before the Common Era, one of them did something no one had done before. He brought the two halves together, the valley and the delta, the white crown and the red, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, one land, one throne, one king who claimed dominion from the first cataract of the Nile to the marshes where the river fans out into the Mediterranean. His name, as far as we can tell, was Narmer. Now, who Narmer actually was, that is a question that has filled academic journals for more than a century, and it is worth lingering over, because the answer is not as simple as it first appears. The ancient Egyptians themselves, writing many centuries after the fact, credited the unification of Egypt to a king they called Menes. The 3rd century BCE historian Manetho, an Egyptian priest who compiled a chronology of pharaohs for the Greek-speaking Ptolemaic court, placed Menes at the very top of his king list, as the founder of the first dynasty. The Abydos king list, carved into the walls of the temple of Seti I around 1280 BCE, does the same. Menes is there at the beginning, the starting point of everything. But here is the difficulty. In all of the archaeological record, in the tombs, in the inscriptions, in the seal impressions pressed into wet clay 5,000 years ago, the name Mens almost never appears in a contemporary context. It is a name that belongs to tradition, to memory, to the stories Egyptians told about their own origins centuries and millennia after the fact. The name that does appear on palette and macehead and jar sealing is Narmer. So were they the same person? The great Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, a man whose name will recur again and again in this story, came to believe so. He proposed that the two names designated one man. Narmer was his Horus name, the divine royal title written inside the Surek, and Menes was a separate royal title, what later Egyptologists call the Nebti or throne name. A 2014 study by Thomas Hege, published in the journal Archaeologists, compiled a list of Egyptologists who had taken a position on the question. Of those surveyed, 41 concluded that Menes was Narmer. 31 identified Menes with Narmer's successor, Hor-Ahar. The debate, in other words, is very much alive. What we can say, with reasonable confidence, is this. The Narmer Palette, that extraordinary slab of carved siltstone found at Hierakonpolis, depicts a king who wears both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. He is shown victorious over enemies from the north. He processes past the bodies of the defeated. A falcon, representing the god Horus, perches above a captive figure. The imagery is unmistakable. This is a king who claims dominion over the whole of the Nile Valley, from the first cataract to the marshes of the delta. The palette itself is a remarkable object. It is carved from a single piece of greywacke siltstone, quarried from the Wadi Hammamat, a dry riverbed in the eastern desert that the Egyptians would use as a source of fine stone for millennia afterward. The siltstone is smooth, dense, and dark greenish-grey. It does not flake like slate or crumble like sandstone. It is a material that lends itself to fine, detailed carving, and the craftsman who made the Narmer Palette was a master. On one face, the side showing the king in smiting pose, Narmer stands tall, wearing the white hedget crown of Upper Egypt. It is a tall, bulbed crown that tapers to a point, and it makes the king appear enormous. He holds a mace in his right hand, raised above his head, about to strike a kneeling prisoner whom he grips by the hair with his left. To his right, a man carries the king's sandals, an attendant of high status, perhaps a priest. A rosette symbol appears near the sandal-bearer, possibly indicating his rank or ritual function. Below the scene, two naked enemies lie sprawled in postures of defeat. Above the prisoner, a falcon, Horus, the sky god, the divine patron of kingship, perches on a set of 6 papyrus stems emerging from a rectangular shape. In his talons, the falcon holds a rope attached to a human head that protrudes from the papyrus. The symbolism is layered. The papyrus represents Lower Egypt. The falcon, the god of the king, holds the north captive. On the other face, Narmer appears again, but now in the red deshret crown of Lower Egypt, flat, with a distinctive spiral curl projecting from the front. He is part of a procession. Before him walk 4 standard bearers carrying the emblems of different deities or regions, an animal skin, a dog, and 2 falcons. Beyond them lie 10 decapitated corpses, their heads placed neatly between their feet. Above the bodies float symbols that may represent conquered towns, a ship, a falcon, a harpoon. At the centre of this same face, 2 long-necked felines, serpopards, creatures that appear in both Egyptian and Mesopotamian art of this period, entwine their necks to form a circular depression. This is the functional part of the palette, the hollow where cosmetics would be ground. Except that this palette was never used for grinding. It is too large, too heavy, too elaborately carved. It was a ceremonial object, a ritual donation to the Temple of Horus at Nekhen, where it was found buried with hundreds of other sacred implements in what Quibell and Green called the main deposit. The Egyptologist Bob Breyer has described the Narmer Palette as the first historical document in the world. Whether or not you accept that characterization, and some scholars argue that the scenes are symbolic rather than strictly historical, the palette remains one of the most significant artifacts ever unearthed. It establishes conventions of Egyptian art that would persist for 3,000 years. The organization of scenes into horizontal registers, the use of hierarchical scale to indicate importance, the depiction of the human body with the head in profile, the torso facing forward, and the legs in profile. The regalia shown, the crowns, the bull's tail hanging from the king's belt, the ceremonial beard, the mace, would remain standard elements of pharaonic imagery from the First Dynasty to the Roman period. And a year label discovered at Abydos by Günther Dreyer, a German Egyptologist whose contributions to this story are immense, appears to depict the same event shown on the palette, suggesting that this was not merely symbolic art but a record of something that actually happened. A battle, a conquest, a unification. Narmer, the fierce catfish, the striker, Egypt's first king. What did it mean to be the first pharaoh? Not in retrospect, not as a line on a king list or a paragraph in a textbook, but in the moment. What would it have felt like to hold together, for the first time, a territory stretching from the first cataract of the Nile to the Mediterranean coast? A distance of over 800 miles in a world without roads, without wheeled vehicles, without anything faster than a boat on the river or a donkey on the track. The pharaoh was not merely a political ruler. From the very beginning, the king of Egypt was understood to be the earthly incarnation of Horus, the falcon god, the lord of the sky, the divine force that maintained order in the universe. The king was the guarantor of Maat, the cosmic balance that kept the sun rising, the Nile flooding, the crops growing, the dead resting. Without the king, the Egyptians believed chaos would return. The forces of Isfet, disorder, entropy, nothingness, would swallow the world. This was not metaphor. This was theology, as real and as urgent to the ancient Egyptians as physics is to us. The king's health was the land's health. His death was a cosmic crisis. And his burial was not a farewell, but a transformation, the moment when the living Horus became the dead Osiris, and the cycle turned, and a new king rose to take the falcon throne. Narmer would not have known the full-blown Osiris mythology of later periods. That complex narrative of death and resurrection, of the murdered god reassembled by his sister wife Isis, of the divine heir Horus who avenges his father and takes the throne. Because the myth, as far as we can tell from the evidence, was still evolving. But the seeds appear to have been there. The falcon imagery on his palette, the bull's tail on his belt linking him to the primal forces of nature, the mace head found alongside the palette at Hierakonpolis, showing what appears to be a ceremony, perhaps a jubilee festival, perhaps a marriage, though scholars remain divided, attended by standard bearers and scribes, with rows of captives and herds of cattle, tallied in some of the earliest known hieroglyphic numbers. He was building something new, not just a kingdom, but a language of power, a visual vocabulary that told everyone who saw it, priest and farmer, northerner and southerner, ally and enemy, that one man held the balance of the world, that he wore 2 crowns because he ruled 2 lands, that the gods had chosen him, that order itself depended on his throne, and when he died, all of that had to be preserved. The tomb had to sustain not just a body but a cosmic function. The provisions were not luxuries, they were necessities. The gold was not decoration, it was fuel for eternity. That is why the empty tomb is not merely disappointing. It is, within the framework of Egyptian belief, catastrophic. If the Ka has no body to inhabit, no food to eat, no name to be spoken, then the dead king ceases to exist. And if the first king ceases to exist, what happens to the chain of legitimacy that stretches from his throne to every pharaoh who followed? What happens to Maat? The Egyptians of later periods seem to have worried about this, or so the archaeological evidence suggests. The Middle Kingdom investigation of el-Qa'ab, the refurbishment of Djer's tomb as the tomb of Osiris, may have been, at least in part, an attempt to repair the damage, to restore the connection between the living and the founding dead, to reassure themselves that the chain was unbroken, even if the evidence suggested otherwise. We cannot know their motives with certainty, but the effort they invested in the site speaks to a deep anxiety about continuity. Now, close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the modern world recede. Let the sounds around you, the hum of a device, the distant murmur of a city or the deep quiet of a house after midnight, let all of it become the wind. The warm, dry wind that blows across the western desert of Egypt, carrying fine sand that tastes of nothing and covers everything. You are standing at Abidos. It is night. The stars are close, so close they seem to hum. The Milky Way is a river above you, and it is not difficult to understand why the Egyptians saw in it the heavenly Nile, the waterway of the gods. The air is cool now, though the ground still radiates the heat of the day. The sand beneath your feet is soft at the surface and firm just beneath, like the crust of bread. Somewhere in the distance the cliffs catch the starlight and hold it, pale and luminous against the deep blue of the sky. You are standing at Abidos. Not the Abidos of tourists and guidebooks, but the deep Abidos, the old Abidos, the place the Egyptians themselves considered one of the most sacred spots on earth. It sits on the west bank of the Nile in what is now the Sohag Governorate of Upper Egypt, about 6 miles from the river. To the east, the green cultivated land, fields of sugarcane and clover that stretch to the riverbank, dotted with palm trees and mud brick villages that have stood in more or less the same places for centuries. To the west, cliffs that curve in a great bay around the site, pale limestone walls that glow orange in the morning light and turn violet at dusk, and beyond them, the boundless desert. The air at Abydos is different from the air along the river. It is drier, hotter. The humidity of the cultivated land drops away as you walk west, and within a few hundred meters you're in a landscape that feels utterly separate from the green world behind you. The ground is hard-packed gravel and sand, pale yellow-brown, strewn with fragments of ancient pottery so numerous that you cannot take a step without crunching something underfoot. The wind moves constantly here, a low, warm breath that carries fine particles of sand and deposits them in drifts against every obstacle. Given enough time, and at Abydos time is measured in millennia, the wind will bury anything. The Egyptians believed that the entrance to the underworld lay here, in a gap in those western cliffs, a natural cleft in the rock that the setting sun seemed to enter each evening. They called the area Pekka. The dead passed through this landscape on their way to the realm of Osiris, and for that reason, from the very earliest times, the powerful and the holy chose to be buried here, as close to that gap as possible, as close to the doorway between worlds as the living could bring them. Far back from the edge of the cultivation, almost at the foot of the cliffs, there is a low rise in the desert. The ground here is different from the surrounding sand. It is littered with fragments of pottery, millions of them, so many that the local name for the place is el-Qa'ab, which means mother of pots. These are the remains of offerings left by pilgrims over thousands of years. Jars of beer, jars of wine, vessels of oil and grain brought to honour the dead kings who were believed to rest beneath the sand. The pottery fragments are so dense in places that they form a layer several centimetres thick, a solid pavement of broken terracotta, glazed and unglazed, some pieces the size of your palm, others ground to dust by centuries of footsteps and weather. And beneath that layer of devotion, the kings were there. Beneath that low rise, buried under centuries of wind-blown sand and shattered ceramics, lay the tombs of every king of the first dynasty of Egypt. Narmer, Horahar, Jer, Jet, Den, Anejib, Semoket, Quaa, and two kings of the late second dynasty as well, Peribsen and Kasekemwi, the oldest royal cemetery in the history of Egypt, and arguably one of the oldest deliberately constructed royal burial grounds in the world. For thousands of years this place was forgotten. The desert covered it. The names were lost. And when the search to rediscover it finally began in the late 19th century, it would be marked by scandal, destruction, rivalry, and a kind of archaeological heartbreak that echoes through the discipline to this day. The story of the excavation of el-Qa'ab begins with a man named Amelineau. He was French. He was born in 1850. His training was not in archaeology, but in Coptic studies, the language and literature of Christian Egypt. How he obtained the concession to excavate one of the most important sites in the ancient world remains something of a mystery. It is known that he had a friend in Victor Loret, who was at the time the director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. Whatever the reason, in 1895 Amelineau arrived at Abidos with an exclusive 5-year permit to dig. What followed was a catastrophe. Amelineau was not an archaeologist in any meaningful sense. He kept no systematic plans. He recorded almost nothing about where objects were found or in what context. He treated the site not as a place of knowledge, but as a source of saleable goods. When he found duplicate stone vessels, objects of immense historical value, he smashed them, reportedly to increase the market price of the ones he kept. According to Flinders Petrie, who would later re-excavate the site, Amelineau boasted that he had reduced unwanted stone vases to chips and used the remains of 5,000-year-old wooden furniture as fuel for his kitchen fire. Petrie's words about the situation were bitter and precise. He described Amelineau's work as a search in which whatever was not removed was deliberately and avowedly destroyed in order to enhance the intended profits of European speculators. That assessment has proven, with the clarity of hindsight, to be largely accurate. In 4 seasons of digging, from 1895 to 1898, Amelineau tore through the royal cemetery of el-Qa'ab. He found tombs, he found extraordinary objects, stelae, ivory carvings, stone vessels, fragments of furniture. On New Year's Day in 1898, he announced the discovery of what he believed was the tomb of Osiris himself, which was in fact the tomb of King Jer of the First Dynasty. Inside, he found a stone bier and cult objects that later Egyptians had placed there as part of their identification of the tomb with the god of the dead. But Amelineau did not understand what he had found. He could not read the stratigraphy. He could not distinguish between objects placed in the tomb 5,000 years ago and those added 1,000 years later. He simply dug and took and sold and left. The damage he inflicted on the archaeological record was devastating. Tomb architecture was destroyed. Stratification was obliterated. Objects were ripped from their contexts and scattered across European collections with almost no documentation. Some ended up in the Louvre, some in Brussels, some in a small museum in Châteaudun, France, where Amelineau donated part of his collection in 1905, and some were sold at auction in Paris in 1904, bought by dealers and collectors who had no idea what they were holding or where, precisely, it had come from. When Amelineau's concession expired, he declared that there was nothing more to be found. The site, he said, was exhausted. He was so well connected in French academic circles that when the concession was reassigned to Petrie, it was reportedly felt unsafe to tell Amelineau directly, for fear that he might return to the site and cause further damage. He did not learn of the transfer for some years. He could not have been more wrong about Abydos being exhausted. Flinders Petrie arrived at Abydos in 1899. He was 46 years old. He had already been excavating in Egypt for nearly 2 decades. He had developed the system of sequence dating that allowed pottery to be used as a chronological marker, a revolutionary method that made it possible to arrange undated finds in relative order, based on the types of vessels found with them. He had trained a generation of archaeologists, including a young man named Howard Carter, who would later discover the tomb of Tutankhamun. He was meticulous, exacting, and famously impatient with those who were not. He lived on a diet that horrified his colleagues: tinned food, stale bread, the occasional onion, and he worked from before dawn until after dark. He expected the same from everyone around him. The concession to dig at Abydos after Amelineau was granted to Petrie by Gaston Maspero, head of the Antiquities Service. Petrie wasted no time. Over 2 seasons, 1899 to 1901, he completely re-excavated the tombs that Amelineau had ravaged. His method was the opposite of Amelineau's. Where Amelineau dug for objects, Petrie dug for information. He mapped, he measured, he recorded the position of every fragment. He sifted the spoil heaps, the piles of debris that Amelineau had discarded as worthless, and in them he found treasure. Within weeks of completing each season, Petrie produced detailed publications. 2 volumes appeared in 1900 and 1901 under the title The Royal Tombs of the First Dynasty and The Royal Tombs of the Earliest Dynasties. They remain essential references today, more than a century later. Scholars have described them as models for future archaeological work. They contain plans, photographs, drawings, and descriptions that are still cited in every major study of the early dynastic period. And what he found, even in the wreckage, was extraordinary. From Amelineau's spoil heaps, the piles of debris that the Frenchman had discarded as worthless, Petrie recovered 18 out of 20 known ivory and ebony year labels from the tomb of King Den. These tiny tablets, each the size of a human thumbnail, bore some of the earliest annalistic records in Egyptian history. They described events in the king's reign, military campaigns, religious festivals, the opening of canals, the arrival of foreign emissaries. One label, perhaps the most famous, shows Den wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the earliest known depiction of a pharaoh in both crowns, as he smites an Asiatic enemy. On the reverse, a pair of sandals is drawn, indicating that the label was once attached to the king's footwear. The sandals of a 5,000-year-old king, tagged with a record of his military triumphs, the mundane and the monumental resting side by side. These labels were the equivalent of finding pages torn from the oldest history book in the world, tossed aside in the rubbish. And Petrie found them not inside the tomb, but in the dirt that Amelineau had shovelled out and left to blow away. Petrie found fragments of carved stele. He found seal impressions that allowed him to identify which tomb belonged to which king. He found evidence of the architectural evolution of royal burial from one reign to the next, and he made one particularly haunting discovery. In the tomb of King Jer, he found a mummified arm, a woman's arm still wrapped in linen bandages and adorned with bracelets of gold, turquoise, lapis lazuli, and amethyst. It remains one of the oldest pieces of jewellery ever discovered in Egypt. But in every tomb, the story was the same. The chambers had been ransacked. The wooden roofs had been burned. The burial goods had been stripped. Whatever had once lain within, the bodies of kings, the treasures meant to sustain them through eternity, was gone. Consider what Petrie's discovery of the mummified arm in Jer's tomb tells us. This single fragment of human remains, a woman's arm still adorned with gold and gemstone bracelets, was one of the very few pieces of any human body found in the entire royal cemetery. In a place that once held the burials of Egypt's founding rulers, almost nothing of the people themselves survived. That tells you everything about the scale of what was lost. Every tomb at el-Qa'ab was looted. Most were looted multiple times, not once, not twice, but again and again across the centuries, each wave of thieves taking what the previous wave had missed. The burning of the wooden chambers, a destruction so total that the resins and oil stored in stone vessels had melted and run out of their containers, appears to have occurred not decades after burial, but quite possibly within a few generations. And the evidence suggests that the robbers were not outsiders. They were people who knew the tombs, people who knew what was inside, people who in some cases had helped build them. This is one of the darkest aspects of early Egyptian history, and one of the least discussed. The tombs of the first dynasty were not hidden. They were marked. Everyone in the vicinity of Abydos would have known where they were. The stelae that flanked the tombs identified the occupant. The funerary enclosures near the cultivation were massive, visible structures. There was no secrecy. The tombs relied instead on respect, on the belief that the dead were sacred, that the car of the king protected his resting place, that the gods would punish anyone who disturbed the royal burial. But belief is a fragile shield. Famine will breach it. Poverty will breach it. Political upheaval, civil war, the collapse of central authority, any of these can turn a sacred site into a quarry. And the transition from the first to the second dynasty at Abydos was not smooth. The final kings of the first dynasty, Anajib, Semeket, Qa'ab, show signs of political instability in the archaeological record. Seal impressions are overwritten, names are erased and replaced. The smooth succession of power that the king lists imply was in reality probably contested and sometimes violent. In such an environment, the tombs of earlier kings, especially kings whose living descendants may no longer have held power, would have been vulnerable. It is reasonable to assume that the guards would have drifted away. The offerings would have stopped. The sand would have begun its slow work of burial. And at some point, one night, one season, one generation, someone would have remembered what was inside those sealed chambers and decided to go in. This is a pattern that haunts the entirety of Egyptian history. A series of papyri from the reign of Ramesses IX, around 1110 BCE, record investigations into tomb robberies in the Theban necropolis. The confessions they preserve are detailed and chilling. A mason named Amenhotep describes how he and his accomplices used copper tools to break into the tomb of a pharaoh, strip the gold from the royal mummies, set fire to the coffins and divide the spoils among themselves. When caught, Amenhotep bribed officials with his share of the stolen gold and was released, only to return and rob again. The workers of Deir el-Medina, the village that housed the artisans who built the royal tombs, were themselves implicated. They knew the layouts, they knew the weak points, they knew which bedrock was soft enough to tunnel through. Tomb robbery in ancient Egypt was not a crime of desperation alone. It was at times an organised enterprise that involved every level of society, from labourers to priests to officials. And if the tombs of the New Kingdom, the grand, deeply buried chambers of the Valley of the Kings, were vulnerable, how much more exposed were the modest mud brick structures of the First Dynasty, 500 miles to the south, guarded by nothing but sand and faith? So when archaeologists finally identified the tomb of Narmer, Egypt's first king, the unifier of two lands, the man whose name appears on the oldest historical document in the world, what did they find? Let us be precise. The tomb attributed to Narmer at el-Qa'ab consists of two chambers, designated B17 and B18 in the numbering system established by Petrie. They lie in Cemetery B, a cluster of tombs at the northern end of the royal necropolis, near the tombs of other early rulers including Ka and Horaha. The identification of B17/B18 as Narmer's tomb was first proposed by Werner Kaiser in 1964, and further confirmed in a 1982 publication by Kaiser and Günther Dreyer, based on seal impressions and other inscriptional evidence recovered during their re-excavation of the site. The chambers are modest by any standard. Together they measure roughly 10 metres by 3 metres. The burial chamber, B18, is approximately 3.35 metres by 5.6 metres, about the size of a small bedroom. It was lined with mud brick and would originally have been roofed with timber, sealed, and covered with a mound of sand and gravel. That is all. Narmer's tomb, the tomb of the man who created Egypt, was about 50 square metres in total. For comparison, the tomb of his successor Horaha was nearly 8 times larger, at 394 square metres. By the end of the First Dynasty, King Kwa's tomb covered 384 square metres, and was subdivided into 13 chambers. And Khâsekhemoui, the last king of the Second Dynasty, built a burial complex of over 1,000 square meters. So Narmer's tomb was small. It was also, like every other tomb at el-Qa'ab, empty. The burial chamber contained no body, no coffin, no rich assemblage of grave goods. Amelineau's rough excavations had passed through it. Petrie's more careful work recovered what fragments remained, and decades later, when the German Archaeological Institute returned to re-examine the site in the late 1970s, they confirmed what had long been suspected. The tomb of Egypt's first pharaoh held nothing but the ghosts of what had once been placed inside it. But here is where the story turns, because empty is a word that means different things depending on how you listen to it. To the treasure hunter, an empty tomb is a disappointment, a dead end, a locked door with nothing behind it. To the archaeologist, an empty tomb is a different kind of text. It still speaks, you just have to know how to read it. Consider what was found in and around Narmer's tomb, even after millennia of looting. Fragments of pottery, some locally made, some imported. Seal impressions bearing Narmer's name, pressed into mud that was once used to seal doors and jars. These impressions are tiny, often no larger than a coin, but they carry the king's Horus name inside a serek, a stylized palace facade that frames the royal identity. They tell us who built this place, and for whom. The architecture itself is informative. The two-chamber design of Narmer's tomb, one room for the burial, one for storage, is the prototype from which all subsequent royal tombs at Abydos evolved. The transition from Narmer's modest structure to the increasingly elaborate multi-chamber complexes of his successors maps the growth of royal power in real time. With each reign, the tomb grew larger, the subsidiary burials more numerous, the imported goods more varied. You can read the rise of pharaonic Egypt in the floor plans of its burial chambers. And then there are the subsidiary graves. Surrounding the tombs of the first dynasty kings at el-Qa'ab are rows of small, shallow graves. These belong to servants, retainers, and officials who were buried alongside their king, in many cases apparently at the time of the royal funeral. The practice of retainer sacrifice, in which members of the royal household were killed and interred to serve the king in the afterlife, is one of the most striking and disturbing features of early Egyptian royal burial. It reaches its peak in the reign of Jer, whose tomb is surrounded by over 300 subsidiary graves. Narmer's tomb does not have clearly documented subsidiary burials in the same number, but the practice was underway. His immediate successor, Hor-Ahar, was buried with around 35 subsidiary graves at his tomb alone, with more at his funerary enclosure. The pattern was set. The king did not go into the next world alone. What would it have been like? Pause here, if you will. Close your eyes more deeply. Let the centuries peel away. Imagine a day around 3050 BCE. The king is dead. Narmer, the catfish, the fierce one, the ruler of two lands, has completed his time on earth. His body has been prepared by the priests. We do not know exactly how. The elaborate mummification techniques of the New Kingdom lie more than 1,000 years in the future. But based on what we know of early burial practices, the dry climate of Upper Egypt, combined with simple desiccation techniques, would have been sufficient to slow the body's decay. The king is wrapped in linen. He's adorned with whatever finery his household possesses, beads of turquoise perhaps, bracelets of gold wire and semi-precious stone, similar to the pieces Petrie found on the mummified arm in the tomb of Jer, an amulet or two carved from ivory or bone. Now picture the procession, a line of figures moving west from the Nile across the desert, toward the cliffs that mark the edge of the world. The mourners carry jars of beer and wine, grain and oil, cuts of meat from cattle slaughtered for the occasion. They carry vessels of stone, diorite, basalt, limestone, alabaster, each one carved with precision, some bearing the king's name. They carry ivory combs and ebony furniture, copper tools and flint knives. They carry everything the king will need in the afterlife, which they imagine as a mirror of this one, a land of green fields and cool water, where the barley grows tall and the Nile never fails. The tomb is ready. It has been under construction perhaps for years. Workers have dug a rectangular pit into the desert hardpan, the firm layer of gravel and clay that lies beneath the surface sand. They have lined it with mud bricks, thousands of them, each one formed by hand from Nile clay mixed with straw and dried in the relentless sun. The bricks are roughly the size of a modern loaf of bread. The walls they form are thick and sturdy, rising 2.5 meters or so from the floor. Wooden beams have been laid across the top, overlapping to create a flat roof. The wood is precious here. There are no forests in the desert, and much of it has been imported from Lebanon, the same cedar that will later be used in the great ships and the coffins of later ages. Inside, the chambers are small, dark and cool. The air smells of earth and brick dust and faintly of the bitumen and resin that seal the jars of food. The walls are rough. There is no decoration, no painted scenes, no carved hieroglyphs. That will come later, in the tombs of the Old Kingdom and beyond. Here, in the very first generation of royal burial, the architecture is simple and functional. A machine for sustaining the king's afterlife. Nothing more, nothing less. The body is placed in the burial chamber. The goods are arranged around it and in the adjoining storage rooms, and then the door is sealed. The workers pile sand and gravel over the structure, forming a low mound. Perhaps a pair of stone stelae, flat slabs of limestone carved with the king's Horus name inside its Serach, are erected at the eastern edge of the mound, marking the entrance. And then the living turn away and walk back toward the river, leaving the king alone with his provisions and his silence. That is how it was meant to be. A body at rest, a storehouse of eternity, a door that would never be opened again. But of course, it was. What Günther Dreyer and the German Archaeological Institute found when they returned to el-Qa'ab, beginning in the late 1970s under Werner Kaiser, with Dreyer joining in 1980 and eventually directing the project, went far beyond what Petrie or Amelineau had imagined. Dreyer was a patient man. He was born in 1943 and studied Egyptology, Assyriology, and Near Eastern archaeology at the University of Hamburg and the Free University of Berlin. He spent decades at the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo, and he devoted much of his career to the re-excavation of el-Qa'ab. Where Amelineau had plundered and Petrie had rescued, Dreyer refined. He brought modern stratigraphic methods, carbon-14 dating, and painstaking analysis to a site that had been dug over 3 times already. And in 1988, in Cemetery U, the oldest part of the necropolis, Dreyer made a discovery that pushed the story of Egyptian kingship back further than anyone had thought possible: Tomb Uj. It lay on a slightly elevated plateau in Cemetery U, between the later royal tombs and a low hill where Petrie had once found New Kingdom funerary figurines. It was not a single chamber, but a complex of 12 rooms, arranged in a roughly rectangular plan, cut into the desert floor and lined with mud brick. It was the largest pre-dynastic tomb ever found in Egypt, and its date, established by carbon-14 analysis of organic material found within, was approximately 3,320 BCE. That placed it roughly 150 years before the beginning of the First Dynasty, 150 years before Narmer, 150 years before the supposed starting point of Egyptian history. The tomb had been robbed in antiquity, like everything else at Abidos, but the robbers had not been thorough, or perhaps they had not understood the value of what they found, because the tomb still contained an astonishing amount of material. Over 400 large ceramic jars, many imported from the region of Palestine, some still bearing traces of wine residue, evidence of long-distance trade on a scale that was previously unimaginable for this period. Grape seeds were found in some of the jars along with fig residue. The wine had been brought from the Levant, a journey of hundreds of miles, and stored in the tomb for the king's use in the afterlife. There were fragments of ivory and bone, combs, pins, small carved objects, pieces of wooden furniture charred but identifiable, obsidian bowls probably from Ethiopia, and in the burial chamber, the broad room at the southwest end of the tomb, an ivory Heka sceptre. A shepherd's crook, smooth and curved, about 20 centimetres long, the hieroglyph for ruler, the symbol of kingship that would endure in Egyptian royal regalia for the next 3,000 years, from the First Dynasty to the Ptolemaic period, held in the crossed hands of every pharaoh who ever sat upon the throne. The tomb belonged to a king, but which king? On many of the jars a symbol had been painted in ink, a scorpion. Dreyer identified the tomb's occupant as an early ruler he called Scorpion I, not to be confused with the later Scorpion king depicted on a mace head found at Hierakonpolis. This was someone older, someone who lived before Narmer, before Hora Ahar, before the unification of Egypt, someone who may have been among the first rulers in the Nile Valley, to hold enough power to commission a tomb of this size, to import goods from foreign lands, and to be buried with the insignia of kingship. And among the contents of Tomb UG were more than 150 small labels, tags of bone and ivory, each about 2 centimetres by 1.5 centimetres, each perforated with a small round hole for attachment to a container, each bearing between 1 and 4 incised signs. Numbers, animals, human figures, abstract symbols. Dreyer believed these were inventory labels, attached to goods in the tomb to record their origin and quantity. Some bore images of hunters with bows, others showed wrestlers, or animals, elephants, mountains, birds. Some appeared to identify specific places, perhaps the estates or plantations from which the goods had been sent. If Dreyer was right, and his interpretation has been widely, though not universally accepted, these labels represented something remarkable. The earliest known examples of Egyptian writing. Not the fully developed hieroglyphics of later centuries, but something recognizable, something legible, something that suggested a sophisticated administrative system was already in place well before the dawn of dynastic history. The labels, each one small enough to rest in the palm of your hand, date to the same period as the tomb itself, approximately 3320 BCE, based on carbon-14 analysis. That made them, at the time of their discovery, among the oldest examples of writing found anywhere in the world, contemporary with, and possibly older than, the earliest cuneiform texts from Mesopotamia. The implications were enormous. They meant that writing in Egypt was not a sudden invention, but a gradual evolution. That kingship did not begin with Narmer, but had deep roots in the centuries before him. That the story of Egypt's origin was not a single dramatic act of unification, but a long, slow gathering of power, culture, and identity. A process that Narmer completed but did not begin. Breathe for a moment. Let the desert settle around you. The wind is quieter now. The stars above the western desert are thick and close, the way they only are in places where no electric light competes with them. The sand is still warm from the day's sun. Somewhere far off, a jackal calls, or perhaps it is the echo of one that called 5,000 years ago, and you are hearing it through the long corridor of time. You are still at Abydos. You are still standing over the place where Narmer was meant to rest forever. And the question remains, what happened to him? The honest answer is that we do not know, and we may never know. There are several possibilities, each with its own weight. The most probable is the most mundane. Narmer was buried in his tomb at el-Qa'ab, with the usual provisions for the afterlife: food, drink, clothing, furniture, tools, jewellery, perhaps even servants, and at some point in the centuries after his death, the tomb was robbed. Completely. The body was destroyed or discarded, the goods were taken, the wooden roof was burned, either by the robbers to provide light or in a deliberate act of destruction. And over the millennia that followed, wind and sand did the rest. This is what happened to nearly every royal burial at Abydos. The tomb of Djer was so thoroughly looted that by the Middle Kingdom, over 1,000 years after his death, Egyptians had identified it as the tomb of Osiris himself, and they were wrong. The tomb of Den, one of the best documented kings of the First Dynasty, yielded its most important artefacts not from inside the chambers, but from Amelineau's spoil heaps. The tomb of Semoket was found by Petrie saturated with perfumed oil that had seeped from broken vessels, filling the sand with a scent that had endured for 50 centuries, but the king himself was gone. A second possibility, less likely but raised by some scholars, is that Narmer's tomb at Abidos was not his primary burial at all, but a cenotaph, an empty memorial tomb, a symbolic resting place meant to connect the king to the sacred landscape of Abydos while his actual remains lay elsewhere. There is precedent for this in later Egyptian history. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom built cenotaphs at Abydos, even as they were buried in other locations, and some scholars have suggested that the early kings of the First Dynasty may have maintained dual burial sites, one at Abydos and one at Saqqara, the great necropolis near Memphis, though this theory remains deeply contentious. A third possibility, the most unsettling, is that Narmer's body was deliberately removed from his tomb at some later date, not by robbers, but by other Egyptians. The evidence from el-Qa'ab shows that the royal tombs were revisited during the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, perhaps as part of an effort to identify which tomb belonged to Osiris. The tomb of Jer was selected for this honour and was refurbished as a place of pilgrimage. Other tombs may have been disturbed in the process. What became of the remains that were displaced we cannot say, and there is one more possibility, barely whispered in the literature, but worth voicing in the dark. Perhaps Narmer was never buried at Abydos at all. Perhaps the tomb was built for him, prepared for him, sealed and covered and left waiting. And then something happened. A change of plan, a political upheaval, a death far from home. The Nile is a long river, the desert is wide, and not every king dies where he expects to. We simply do not know. But let us step back from the mystery and consider what the tomb of Narmer, even empty, even silent, has taught us. It taught us where the pharaohs began. Before the excavations at el-Qa'ab, the location of Egypt's earliest royal burials was unknown. Scholars had texts, they had king lists, they had Manetho's chronology, but they did not have the physical tombs. The discovery and identification of the royal cemetery at Abidos, a process that unfolded across more than a century, from Amelineau's destructive digging to Dreyer's meticulous reanalysis, grounded the origin of pharaonic civilization in a specific, real, visitable place. It taught us how royal burial evolved, from the modest two-chamber structure of Narmer's tomb to the sprawling multi-room complexes of later reigns. The architecture of el-Qa'ab tells the story of increasing royal power in physical form, the growing size of the tombs, the growing number of subsidiary burials, the growing volume and variety of grave goods, the introduction of the stairway entrance under King Den, the shift from simple mud-brick pits to elaborate subterranean palaces. Each innovation at Abydos can be traced forward to the mastabas, the step pyramids, and eventually the Great Pyramids of Giza. The tomb of Narmer is, in a very real sense, the seed from which the pyramids grew. It taught us about trade and diplomacy. The goods found in First Dynasty tombs at Abydos, imported wine jars from Palestine, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, obsidian from Ethiopia, cedar wood from Lebanon, reveal a network of long-distance exchange that was already well established at the dawn of dynastic history. Narmer's Egypt was not an isolated kingdom. It was part of a web of connections stretching across the ancient Near East. And there is more. About 1.5 kilometers northeast of the royal tombs at el-Qa'ab, closer to the edge of the cultivation, Petrie and later excavators uncovered a series of enormous rectangular enclosures built of mud brick. These are the so-called funerary enclosures, massive walled structures, some covering areas larger than a football pitch, with panelled facades that imitate the appearance of a royal palace. Each enclosure appears to have been associated with a specific king of the First or Second Dynasty. Their interiors contained buildings whose precise function remains uncertain, perhaps temporary structures used in the funeral rites, perhaps representations of the king's palace in the afterlife. The largest surviving enclosure, known as the Shunet el-Zabib, belonged to the Second Dynasty king Khasekhemwy. Its walls still stand to a height of several meters, one of the oldest standing mud brick structures on Earth. Walking alongside them, you can see the recessed panels, the pilasters, the carefully articulated facade that echoes the woven matte patterns of early palace architecture. These enclosures were not tombs themselves. They were part of the tomb complex. They served a ritual purpose that we cannot fully reconstruct, but their scale is astonishing. They tell us that the earliest kings of Egypt were investing enormous resources, labour, materials, organisational capacity in the architecture of death. And here is the crucial link. The combination of a subterranean burial at el-Qa'ab and a monumental enclosure near the cultivation is, in the eyes of many scholars, the prototype for the later pyramid complex. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, built around 2680 BCE, the first monumental stone building in human history, combines a burial beneath the ground with an enormous rectangular enclosure above it. The pattern was established at Abydos, in mud brick, more than 400 years earlier. The seed was planted in the very first dynasty. This is what the tomb of Narmer teaches us, even in its emptiness. It is not a dead end. It is a beginning. The beginning of a tradition that would produce the most recognizable structures ever built by human hands. It also taught us something harder to quantify, but perhaps more important than anything else. It taught us about loss, about the fragility of memory, about the immense gap between what a civilization intends to preserve and what actually survives. Think about it this way. Narmer, if he was indeed the first pharaoh, founded a state that endured for 3,000 years, 30 centuries, more than twice the span of time between the fall of Rome and the device you're using to listen to these words. His kingdom produced the pyramids, the Sphinx, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, a literature and a mythology and an art that have shaped human culture to this day. And yet, of the man himself, almost nothing physical survives. We have his name on a palette. We have his name on seal impressions. We have a tomb that was meant to house his body for eternity, and it held him for perhaps a few generations at most before it was broken open and stripped bare. The pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom saw this. They saw what happened to the tombs at Abydos and at Saqqara, and they responded with the most ambitious engineering project in human history. They built bigger, they built deeper. They built in stone instead of brick, with hidden chambers and granite portcullises and passageways designed to confuse and exhaust any thief who tried to reach the burial within. It did not work. Almost every pyramid was robbed. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, the largest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, was found empty. The sarcophagus of Khafra, empty. The burial chamber of Menkaure, empty. The whole history of Egyptian royal burial is in many ways a 5,000-year argument between those who wanted to take their treasures into the next world and those who wanted to take them for this one. There is only one notable exception. One tomb that survived largely intact through 3,000 years of systematic looting. The tomb of a minor king of the 18th dynasty, buried in a small, hastily prepared chamber in the Valley of the Kings, whose entrance was accidentally buried beneath flood debris and workmen's huts, and forgotten. Tutankhamun. The most famous archaeological discovery in history exists only because it was, by the standards of royal burial, insignificant. The greatest pharaohs, Khufu, Ramesses, Thutmose, were erased. A boy king survived. There is a lesson in that, though it is difficult to say exactly what it is. Perhaps it has something to do with the relationship between ambition and vulnerability. The more magnificent the tomb, the greater the target. Khufu built the Great Pyramid, 2.3 million blocks of limestone, the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4 millennia, and his burial chamber was found bare. Ramesses II, who ruled for over 60 years, and whose colossal statues still tower over the landscape at Abu Simbel, was found not in his own tomb but in a royal cache at Deir el-Bahri, where priests of the 21st dynasty had hidden his mummy along with dozens of other displaced pharaohs in a desperate attempt to protect them from thieves. The great king, who had filled the Nile Valley with monuments to his own glory, spent most of the last 3,000 years stuffed into someone else's coffin, in a hidden chamber behind a cliff. But Tutankhamun, who ruled for about 10 years and accomplished relatively little, was buried in a small, hastily decorated tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and his burial survived almost intact. Howard Carter, standing at the entrance to the antechamber on the 26th of November 1922, peered through a hole in the sealed doorway and saw, by the light of a candle, gold. Everywhere. He later described the moment in terms that have become legendary. But what is often forgotten is that even Tutankhamun's tomb had been robbed. Twice, apparently. The first time, thieves took linen and cosmetics. The second time, they went deeper and took perhaps 60% of the jewellery from the burial. They were caught, or interrupted. The tomb was resealed, and then, through accidents of geology and construction, flash floods deposited layers of alluvium, and workers building a later tomb erected huts over the entrance. It was forgotten. That is the margin between fame and oblivion. A pile of construction debris, a few metres of rubble. The difference between Tutankhamun and every other pharaoh in the Valley of the Kings is, in the end, not significance, but luck. There is another sensory detail from el-Qa'ab that belongs in this story, and it is one of the strangest. When Petrie excavated the tomb of King Samerket, the 7th ruler of the First Dynasty, he found something he did not expect. The sand filling the entrance ramp to the burial chamber was saturated with perfumed oil, ointments, unguents, and resins that had been stored in stone vessels as offerings for the king's afterlife had, over the centuries, melted, leaked, and seeped through the debris. The sand, to a depth of nearly a metre, was soaked with it, and the scent was still there. After 5,000 years, Petrie described encountering an overwhelming aroma of perfume as he dug through the entrance to the tomb. Imagine that. Standing in the Egyptian desert at the turn of the 20th century, breathing air that carries a fragrance prepared for a king who died before the invention of the wheel. The oils had been intended for use in the afterlife, to anoint the body, to purify the spirit, to ensure that the king would arrive in the next world fresh and clean and ready for eternity. The king was gone. The afterlife, whatever it was, had received him or had not. But the perfume endured, a ghost of intention, a trace of care, the evidence not of the king himself, but of the people who loved him enough or feared him enough or believed deeply enough in the power of ritual to fill his tomb with the most precious substances they possessed. That, too, is a kind of survival. What does any of this mean? Not to Egyptology, not to the history of archaeology, but to you, right now, tonight, lying in the dark. Perhaps this: we spend our lives building things we believe will last. Relationships, careers, homes, legacies. We save photographs. We write journals. We tell our children stories about who we are and where we came from. We do this because we know, somewhere beneath the surface of daily life, that time is not kind. That forgetting is the natural state of the universe, and remembering is the exception. That every name, no matter how famous, will eventually be spoken for the last time. Narmer knew this too. Or if he did not know it, the people who built his tomb knew it. They placed food and drink in the chambers. They sealed the doors. They covered the grave. They did everything they could to ensure that the first king of Egypt would endure in the next world as he had in this one. And the desert undid it all. But something survived. Not the gold, not the body, not the treasures. What survived were fragments. A seal impression here, a carved palette there, a pair of mud brick walls in the sand. Enough for a German archaeologist in 1982 to say, with quiet certainty, this was his. Enough for us, 5,000 years later, to speak his name: Narmer, Catfish, Chisel, King. Is that not, in its own way, a kind of immortality? Not the one he planned for, not the golden eternity of the Egyptian afterlife with its fields of reeds and its endless banquets, but something more modest and perhaps more real, a name that persists, a question that remains open, a story that is still being told tonight in the dark to someone who may already be drifting towards sleep. There is one more thing worth knowing before we leave Abydos. The site is still being excavated. It has never stopped giving up its secrets. In January 2025, archaeologists from the Penn Museum at the University of Pennsylvania, working in cooperation with the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, announced the discovery of a massive limestone burial chamber at a site called Anubis Mountain, a natural pyramid-shaped formation at Abidos that the ancient Egyptians considered sacred. The tomb was found nearly 7 meters underground. It contained multiple rooms, decorated entryways, and mud brick vaults rising nearly 5 meters high. It belonged to a king. But the hieroglyphic text that once recorded his name had been damaged by tomb robbers and could not be read. Josef Wegner, the Penn Museum curator who led the excavation, described the discovery as a window into the enigmatic Abydos Dynasty, a series of rulers from the Second Intermediate Period, around 1640 to 1540 BCE, who governed part of Upper Egypt during a time of political fragmentation and are largely absent from the official king lists. These are kings who were forgotten by their own civilization, kings whose names were left off the carved cartouches in the temples, kings who ruled and built and died and were erased, not by tomb robbers alone, but by the deliberate choices of later pharaohs who preferred a neat, unbroken line of succession to the messy truth of Egypt's past. And yet, beneath the sand, their tombs remain, waiting, patient, as though the dead have a longer sense of time than the living. The work of the German Archaeological Institute at el-Qa'ab, which began under Werner Kaiser in 1977 and continued under Günther Dreyer until his death in March 2019, transformed our understanding of the royal cemetery. Dreyer spent more than 40 years at Abidos. He devoted his life to a stretch of desert that most tourists never visit, to tombs that contain no gold and no mummies, to fragments of pottery and bone that required years of painstaking analysis to yield their secrets. What the German mission found, or more precisely what they reconstructed from evidence that 3 previous waves of excavation had disturbed, was a far more detailed picture of early royal burial than anyone had assembled before. They clarified the stratigraphy. They established more precise dates. They identified architectural features that had been overlooked or misunderstood. They discovered that the tombs had not been covered with simple sand mounds as previously assumed, but with internal brick-lined structures, subterranean mounds built inside retaining walls, invisible from the surface. These hidden mounds were not meant to mark the grave. They served some other purpose for the deceased. One interpretation suggests they may have represented the primordial mound of creation from which the Egyptians believed the world had emerged, though this remains a matter of scholarly discussion. In the tomb of King Den, the German team found evidence of a subsidiary structure near the southern corner, a small brick-lined space that may have served a ritual purpose. In the tomb of King Kia, the last ruler of the First Dynasty, they discovered Middle Kingdom pottery on the floor of the burial chamber, along with a staircase that had been rebuilt in later bricks, evidence that Egyptians of the 12th Dynasty, 1,000 years after Kia's death, had entered the tomb and partially restored it. The reason, almost certainly, was their search for the tomb of Osiris. They were looking backward, just as we are, trying to find the beginning. And Dreyer discovered something else, something that changes the entire narrative of the royal cemetery. He found that many of the First Dynasty tombs showed evidence of immense fires, not the casual burning of a torch, but conflagrations hot enough to melt the resins in stone vessels and char the wooden roofing into charcoal. The fires appear to have occurred relatively soon after burial. Some scholars have suggested that the burning was deliberate, a ritual act perhaps meant to release the king's spirit from the physical world, or to prevent the reuse of sacred objects. Others believe the fires were set by tomb robbers, who used flame for light and heat as they worked through the chambers. Still others have proposed that the fires could have been accidental, caused by the interaction of oils and resins in the sealed, oxygen-poor environment. No single explanation accounts for all the evidence, and the truth likely varies from tomb to tomb. But the result was the same. The wooden architecture was destroyed, the organic materials were consumed, and by the time the first modern excavators arrived, what remained of the greatest royal cemetery in the ancient world was a field of charred brick and broken pottery, covered in sand, mistaken by locals for nothing more than a dump of shattered jars. El-Qa'ab, the mother of pots, hiding the fathers of kings. Abydos endures because it was never just a cemetery, it was an idea. From the First Dynasty to the Roman period, a span of over 3,000 years, Egyptians made pilgrimages to this place. They left offerings, they carved inscriptions, they built temples and chapels and cenotaphs. They brought jars of beer and wine and food, so many that the ground itself became a layer of broken pottery centimetres deep. They came because they believed that the god Osiris, lord of the dead, was buried here. They came because they believed that proximity to the sacred ground of Abidos would benefit them in the afterlife. And in a sense, they were not wrong. Not about Osiris, that was a later interpretation, but about the sanctity of the place. The kings of the First Dynasty were buried here because Abydos already had deep roots as a site of ritual and burial, stretching back to the pre-dynastic period. The cemetery called U, where Dreyer found tomb UJ, contains graves that predate the First Dynasty by centuries. The very oldest burials at Abydos may go back to the Nakada I period, around 4000 BCE. For 2,000 years before Narmer, people had been bringing their dead to this stretch of desert. Why? The cliffs, perhaps. The gap in the western hills that looked like a doorway to the other world. The isolation. The dryness that preserved bodies and objects in the sand. Or something else, something harder to name. A quality of the landscape that spoke to the human need for a place where the living and the dead could meet. The Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE, investigated the royal cemetery at el-Qa'ab and identified the tomb of King Jer as the burial place of Osiris. They built a staircase into the tomb for the convenience of pilgrims. They placed a stone bier inside bearing the name of a 13th dynasty ruler, possibly Djedkeperu, carved to hold the recumbent form of the god. For centuries afterward, Egyptians visited this spot to leave offerings and prayers. The identity of Jer, a real king who lived around 3000 BCE, was submerged beneath the weight of myth. He became Osiris. His tomb became a temple. This is what happens to the very old. They do not merely die, they are transformed. Their lives become stories. Their names become symbols. Their graves become shrines, and the original meaning, the person they actually were, the meals they ate, the words they spoke, the particular way they watched the sun set over the Nile, all of that is lost, replaced by something larger and vaguer and more permanent. Narmer has undergone this transformation too. He is no longer a man, he is a concept. The first pharaoh, the unifier, the beginning of the line, the name at the top of the list. What he loved, what he feared, how he governed, how he sounded when he laughed. All of that is gone. What remains is the name, the catfish and the chisel, and the empty tomb. There are patterns in this story that appear elsewhere, if you care to look. In Mesopotamia, at the ancient city of in what is now southern Iraq, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated the royal cemetery in the 1920s and found tombs of kings and queens from the early dynastic period, roughly contemporary with the first dynasty of Egypt. Like the tombs at Abydos, many had been robbed, but some survived. The tomb of Queen Puabi contained a stunning golden headdress, lapis lazuli jewellery, lyres decorated with bulls' heads in gold and lapis, and the bodies of dozens of attendants who appear to have been sacrificed at the time of the Queen's burial, a practice strikingly similar to the subsidiary burials at el-Qa'ab. The parallels between and Abidos are remarkable. Two civilizations separated by 1,000 miles of desert and mountain, arriving independently at the same solution: bury the king with everything he might need, including the people who served him. The logic is the same, the theology is different. The result, a vast repository of treasure, followed by inevitable plundering, is identical. In China, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, was buried around 210 BCE in a mausoleum so vast that it has still not been fully excavated. His terracotta army of over 8,000 figures was discovered in 1974 by farmers digging a well near the city of Xi'an. The emperor's actual burial chamber remains sealed, in part because of ancient texts that describe rivers of mercury flowing through a model of his empire, and modern soil testing has confirmed elevated mercury levels in the mound. The Chinese government has chosen to leave it closed, reasoning that the technology to properly excavate and preserve the contents does not yet exist. The first emperor, like Narmer, built for eternity. Unlike Narmer, his main chamber has not yet been opened, but the looters found other parts of the complex. Evidence of fire and theft exists even there, and the question remains, what awaits inside? Will it be the splendour described in the ancient texts? Or will it be, like so many royal chambers before it, empty, cleaned out by someone at some point through some entrance we have not yet found? And in the Americas, the Moche lords of Peru were buried in elaborate tombs at Sipan in the Lambayeque Valley around 250 CE. The tomb of the Lord of Sipan, discovered in 1987 by the Peruvian archaeologist Walter Alva, was one of the richest intact burials ever found in the Western Hemisphere. Gold and silver headdresses, turquoise and shell pectorals, ceramic vessels depicting warriors and deities. But it was found only because police had intercepted looted artefacts on the black market and traced them back to the site. A neighbouring tomb had already been completely ransacked. The Lord of Sipan survived by accident and by the speed of the excavation. Another season, another month of delay, and the looters would have reached him too. Across time, across continents, across cultures that never knew of one another's existence, the pattern repeats. Sumer and Egypt, Egypt and China, China and Peru, the powerful build tombs. The tombs are filled with treasure. The treasure attracts thieves, and the archaeologists, centuries or millennia later, arrive to reconstruct what they can from the debris. It is as though every civilization independently arrives at the same conclusion, that the dead must be provisioned for the journey ahead, and every civilization independently discovers the same bitter truth, that the living will not leave those provisions alone. The desire to transcend death and the desire to profit from that desire are twin forces, intertwined from the very beginning, and neither has ever fully prevailed over the other. What does this tell us? Not about tomb robbers, their motives are obvious enough and need no explanation, but about the impulse that puts the treasure in the tomb in the first place. Why do we bury our dead with things they cannot use? Why do we build chambers for bodies that cannot appreciate them? Why do we carve names into stone when we know, in the rational part of our minds, that the stone will eventually crumble? The Egyptians had an answer. They believed in Ka, the life force, the spiritual double that remained tied to the body after death. The Ka needed food, drink, and shelter. It needed a physical form to inhabit. Without these things, the Ka would starve, and the dead person would cease to exist entirely. The tomb was not a memorial. It was a machine, a technology for sustaining consciousness beyond the boundary of death. This belief was so fundamental, so deeply woven into the fabric of Egyptian culture, that it shaped every aspect of their civilization. The pyramids, the mummification process, the pyramid texts, and the Book of the Dead. The entire vast apparatus of Egyptian funerary religion was built on the premise that death was not an ending but a transition, and that the quality of that transition depended on physical preparation. And the robbers? They were people who lived in the same culture. They knew what they were destroying. They knew that by taking the food from the tomb they were starving the Ka. By destroying the body, they were erasing the dead person from existence. They knew the theological consequences of what they did, and they did it anyway. Perhaps because they were desperate. Perhaps because they did not believe. Perhaps because, as the World History Encyclopedia notes, the temptation of gold was simply stronger than the threat of supernatural punishment. This is a very human contradiction. We build monuments to eternity and tear them down for scrap. We write love letters and burn them. We plant trees and cut them down. We are creatures who are capable of immense care and immense destruction, sometimes in the same act, sometimes in the same breath. Narmer's empty tomb is a monument to this contradiction. Someone, his family, his priests, his people, poured their resources into building a chamber that would sustain their king forever. And someone else, perhaps their grandchildren, perhaps strangers, perhaps the descendants of the very workers who laid the bricks, broke it open and took everything inside. Both acts were human. Both were sincere in their way. And 5,000 years later, what remains is neither the devotion nor the theft, but the emptiness they left behind, a silence that holds both stories at once without choosing between them. The ancient Egyptians had a concept they called Ren, the name. In their theology, a person had 5 distinct aspects of the soul: the Ka, the Ba, the Ak, the Shiut, or shadow, and the Ren. The name was considered as essential to continued existence as the body itself. To speak someone's name was to give them life. To erase it was to kill them a second time. This is why, throughout Egyptian history, the deliberate erasure of a pharaoh's name from monuments, a practice known as damnatio memoriae, was considered the ultimate punishment. When Hatshepsut's successor, Thutmose III, ordered her images and cartouches chiselled from temple walls, the intent was not merely political. It was metaphysical. He was attempting to erase her from eternity, and this is why the survival of Narmer's name is significant in a way that goes beyond mere identification. His body is gone, his tomb is empty, his gold was melted down millennia ago, reshaped into objects we will never connect to him. But his Ren, his name, endures. On the Narmer Palette, on seal impressions at Abydos, on jar fragments found as far away as the Nile Delta and the hills of southern Canaan. His name has outlasted his body, his tomb, his treasure, and his kingdom. It has outlasted the language in which it was first written. There is something to sit within that, something quiet and vast. The Egyptians were right about the name, even if they were wrong, or right who can say, about the Ka and the Ba. The name is the last thing to go. It is more durable than gold, more persistent than stone, more resilient than any tomb ever built. Long after the body dissolves and the objects scatter and the walls collapse, the name remains, carried forward in texts and stories and conversations, passed from one generation to the next like a flame handed from torch to torch across the dark. Let us return, one last time, to where we began. A slab of siltstone in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, 63 centimetres tall, carved on both sides, a king in a white crown raising a mace, a king in a red crown surveying the dead, a catfish and a chisel, spelling out a name that has survived 5,000 years. Narmer. They found his name. They found his image. They found his tomb. And the tomb was empty. But perhaps that is not the end of the story. Perhaps it is the beginning. Because the emptiness of Narmer's tomb is not a silence. It is a question. It is the same question that drives every archaeologist back into the desert, every historian back into the archives, every dreamer back into the dark to wonder about the past. What was here? what was lost, and what, against all odds, survives. The first pharaoh built a kingdom that lasted 3,000 years. His tomb survived beneath the desert for 5,000. When we finally opened it, the man himself was gone. But his name is still here, in this room, in your ear, in the air between the words, and that perhaps is the truest kind of eternity. Not the body preserved in linen, not the gold stacked in chambers, but the name spoken in the dark by someone who was never born when the kingdom was young, in a language the king himself would not recognize, on a night 5 millennia removed from the night they sealed the door. There is something else, one final thought to carry with you into sleep. We speak of Narmer as the first pharaoh, the beginning, the founder. And in a political sense that is true. He was the first ruler whose name appears in connection with both Upper and Lower Egypt. He was the first to wear both crowns. He was the first to be buried at el-Qa'ab as king of a unified land. But Dreyer's discovery of Tomb UG and its scorpion king reminds us that Narmer was not the beginning of everything. He was a culmination. Before him, there were generations of rulers whose names are barely known. Ka, Ierihor, Scorpion, and before them, centuries of chieftains and elders and strongmen whose names are not known at all. The unification of Egypt did not happen in a single generation. It was the work of centuries, and most of the people who contributed to it left no trace that we can read. This is true of all great events. The founding of any nation, the birth of any civilization, the creation of any enduring institution. These things appear sudden only from a distance. Up close, they are slow, incremental, and the credit belongs to thousands of people whose names were never carved in stone. Narmer stands at the summit of a pyramid of forgotten effort. He is the name we have. Behind him, in the dark, are all the names we do not have. The farmers who first figured out how to grow barley in the flood-enriched soil, the potters who standardized the vessels that became Egypt's first units of exchange, the priests who first articulated the idea that a single ruler could embody the divine order of the universe, the soldiers who marched and fought and died so that one man could wear 2 crowns. They are all there, buried deeper than any tomb, beneath the foundations of everything that followed. And if Narmer's tomb is empty, then theirs, those earlier, simpler, unnamed graves scattered across the desert, are emptier still. Their bodies have dissolved into the sand. Their grave goods, if they had any, have long since crumbled. Their names were never written down. And yet, the grain still grows in the Nile Valley. The river still floods, though it is dammed now. The land is still lived on, still farmed, still loved. The thread that those unknown people began to weave is still being woven, 5,000 years later, by the millions of people who live along the Nile today. That is the deepest kind of survival. Not the name, not the tomb, not the gold, but the continuation of the thing itself, the civilization, the culture, the way of being human in a particular place on earth. Narmer's Egypt is gone, but Egypt is not. The river is not. The land is not. The people are not. And in that continuity, in that unbroken thread of life along the Nile, every king and every farmer and every unnamed labourer who ever lived in the valley is, in some quiet way, still present. If this story stayed with you, if it followed you through the quiet places between waking and sleeping, I would be glad if you pressed the like button. It helps others find this channel in the way that you found it tonight. And if you want to stay here a while longer, there are more stories waiting in the playlist. Lost temples, buried cities, questions that no one has quite answered yet. If something in tonight's story made you think, a detail, a connection, a question of your own, leave it in the comments. This is a place for slow thinking, for ideas that arrive in the middle of the night, for the kind of curiosity that does not need to prove anything to anyone. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.